You're listening to Beat Autoimmune and Thrive, the podcast all about reversing and preventing autoimmune conditions so you can live your most vibrant life as soon as possible. We talk about autoimmune root causes, actionable solutions, and inspirational healing stories. I'm Palmer Kippola, and I used to have MS. Today, I'm an author, a speaker, a functional medicine certified health coach, a pickleball player, and nature lover who's helped thousands of people reclaim their health and their best lives. Let's dive into this episode. Welcome, everybody. I am delighted to be here today with Mark Wolynn. He is the director of the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco. He is a leading expert in the field of inherited family trauma. His book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle, is the winner of the 2016 Silver Novelist Book Award in Psychology. It's been translated into 19 languages. His articles have appeared in Psychology Today, Mind Body Green, and mariashriver.com. And his poetry has appeared in The New Yorker. Mark specializes in working with people who are experiencing depression, anxiety, panic disorders, emotional pain, and unexplained and mysterious persistent symptoms and conditions. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Palmer. Thank you for having me today.
It is an honor. This is such a rich and important field to dig into, because we're speaking to a growing number of people who are seeking to heal from autoimmune conditions. And I know from both personal and professional experience that emotional pain, childhood trauma is almost always involved as the setup for autoimmunity to appear even decades later. I think what people may not understand is the concept of inherited family trauma. They may understand the concept of absorbing emotional pain from their parents, but this is new terrain, and I'm excited to dig into it. So why don't we start with a definition of what is inherited family trauma?
So let's say that one of our parents or grandparents lost their mother or father when they were young, or they were sent away, or when they were a child, to grandmother's house for a summer, or someone was placed in an orphanage, or one of our parents' siblings died tragically, and this event broke the heart of the family, rigidifying the whole family. The reaction to the trauma doesn't necessarily stop with those who experienced it. The feelings and sensations, specifically the stress response, the stress reaction, can be passed on to their children and their grandchildren. That's us and our kids. And now we have biological evidence for this.
That is absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to dig into this deeper with you. And sometimes the best place to start is story, because those of us, the whole idea of pain to purpose, sometimes we have our own story that leads us to what we're doing today. So can you take us to your story? What happened? How did you get so passionate about this work?
Yeah. So I had symptoms I couldn't explain. And this is about 30 years ago. I began to lose the vision in one of my eyes. And I was diagnosed with a chronic form of retinopathy, for which there was no cure. And the best the doctors could tell me is, well, we think it's stress, but we don't know a lot about it. And then they said, and the way it's progressing, you're likely to lose the vision in your other eye as well. And you can only imagine, I'm completely freaked out, and there's nothing that they can tell me that will heal it or work. And I'm trying everything alternative. I'm going to, I did juice fasts, hands-on healing, acupuncture, acupressure, supplements, everything really. Not to say that any of these conditions or any of these modalities aren't effective. They are. But it isn't about, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, in this talk, it isn't about what someone does to us. It's what happens inside us that's the real factor for our healing. So all I knew to do at this point, when everything I did was making it worse, was to go on a search for healing. And the search, meant leaving my city, leaving my work, leaving my relationship, and just following books, teachers, masters, who, where their message resonated with me. And literally, I went on a search for healing that led me as far as Indonesia. I mean, halfway around the globe, where I'm studying from several wise spiritual teachers who taught me some fundamental principles, one of which was the importance of healing my relationship with my parents, which was completely broken. But before I could heal this relationship with them, I had to work with what stood in the way, which was inherited family trauma. But I don't know it at this time. Specifically, the anxiety that I'd inherited from all my grandparents who were orphaned in some way. 3 of them lost their mothers when they were babies or toddlers. And the 4th lost her dad when she was 1, and ultimately loses her mom too, because her mom would be grieving. And this anxiety, this I would learn, was the real cause of my vision loss. So, as did my parents, I had inherited this feeling of being broken from a mother's love. And this was passed down in my family. And I remember being a small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, running into my mom's room every time she'd leave the house and opening her drawers and crying into her scarves and her nightgowns and, panicking that I'd never see her again. And that all I would have left was her smell, which would have been true, later on when I look back from my grandparents who did lose their mothers. Maybe they had a garment or a house coat that was left. And I remember 40 years later sharing this with my mom. And she said, I did the same thing when my mom would left the house. And then my sister, reading the book, says, honey, I did that too when mom would leave the house. And so the family pattern, because we inherit this stress response, was weeping into our mother's clothes and breathing in her scent. And I guess the last thing to say about it is, after healing the broken attachment, the broken bond with my mom, my sight came back. I didn't know it would come back. At that point, I wasn't even waiting for it to come back. But afterwards, the principles that I had learned about healing with our parents is possible, even if they've done some unthinkable things. And ultimately, I developed a method for healing the effects of inherited family trauma.
That is so beautiful. And it sounds like, well, you had the breadcrumbs, the golden nuggets that took you down the path to figuring out what the attachment trauma or the detachment from your mother and how repairing that attachment could repair you. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when we look at the science, this is one of the most replicated studies in all of epigenetics. They separate baby mice, and I can talk about why they use mice. In fact, I will talk about why they use mice. But and they see that the effects can be observed for 3 generations. Let me sort of go into this whole idea of the research that's out there, because for some of the listeners there, this will be new material. So, why are we born with our parents and our grandparents' stress responses? They used to think that we're born as a clean hard drive. As soon as the next generation comes, everything's wiped clean. And what they're finding, to use a computer analogy, that there's this operating system that's already in place that contains the fallout from our parents' traumas and our grandparents' traumas. And here we are, born with fears and feelings that don't belong to us. And why is this? So let's go back to the nature of trauma. When a trauma happens, it changes us. Literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA. And then this changes the way our genes function, sometimes for generations. Technically, there's a chemical tag that attaches to the DNA after this trauma. And it tells the cells, hey, thing that just happened, we're not going to survive it unless we enable these genes to function, silence these genes, turn up this genetic material, turn down this genetic material, enabling us to better deal with this thing that just happened. And then the way our genes are affected changes how we act or feel. For example, we can become sensitive to situations or reactive to situations that are similar to this original trauma, even if this original trauma occurred in a past generation, so that we have a better chance of surviving it in this generation. Let me give an example of how it works. So let's say our grandparents come from a war-torn country. Maybe they grew up in London during the bombings, or in Germany during the bombings, and or Rwanda or Cambodia. There's bombs going off, there's bullets flying, there's uniformed men lining people up in the square, there's people being shot or taken away. So our grandparents would develop an epigenetic adaptation, sort of like a skill set. And this adaptation, this skill set could be, on the good side, sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times, reactions to the violence to help them survive this trauma. This is what they would pass down. The problem is what they're passing down is a stress reaction, a stress response, and we can inherit a stress response with the dials set to 10. And here we are prepared for this war or this catastrophe, even though we're born in suburban Minnesota, and we rarely make the link that our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our depression is connected to our parents and our grandparents, the loss of their babies, the loss of their parents. We just think we're wired this way. I have so many people who I work with say, well, this is just how I am. I'm wired this way. Mm-hmm. This is how it is. And we rarely think that it's gene change, it's gene expression that we've inherited. And the sad part is this gene expression doesn't stop with us. It can be transmitted to our kids and our kids' kids.
Well, that's why I love the ending, the tagline of your book is how to end the cycle. I mean, that's what we're talking about today, is first being aware of it and then having some skills to be able to stop it with you, right?
Exactly. The scientists, they've long suspected that something like this was going on, but the science just wasn't out there. Yeah. Well, now it's out there. And when I've been working in this field for almost 30 years, the interesting thing is we didn't have the science. When I'm working with people, I used to not be able to explain it. Now, thank goodness, about 15 years ago, Rachel Yehuda, the neuroscientist out of Mount Sinai Medical, she's working with Holocaust survivors and their children. And she's saying, something's up here, because the children of the Holocaust survivors are experiencing the same trauma symptoms, specifically the low levels of cortisol, not high levels of cortisol, the low levels of cortisol, the stress hormone that gets us back to normal again. And she's also the one who does that study with pregnant mothers who are at or near the World Trade Center, who go on to develop PTSD. And she finds out that their kids go on to develop PTSD, and they're born, they're smaller for their gestational age. They're born with 16 genes that express differently than kids who aren't born to pregnant mothers during the World Trade Center attack. She also tells us that you and I are 3 times more likely to have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder if just one of our parents had PTSD. And as a result, we're likely to struggle with depression and anxiety. These patterns, as we know, are observed for 2 generations in humans. That's because it takes 12 to 20 years, and the science is about 15 years old, to get a generation in humans. But studies with mice show that they can be observed for 3 generations, and you can get a generation of mice in 12 to 20 weeks. But what's more significant is that mice and humans share a similar genetic makeup. Over 92, 93% of the genes in humans have counterparts in mice, with over 80% being identical. And this is where they cause adversity in the lab to baby mice. And they see the effects for 3 generations, 3 or more generations.
Isn't there
There's
a
this one
the cherry blossom study? Tell that one.
Oh, yeah. I love that study. So this is done in Emory Medical School in Atlanta. And the researcher, Brian Diaz, says, well, what happens if I make mice afraid of a cherry blossom-like scent? What if every time they smell this scent, I shock them? And he does that. And right in that first generation, Palmer, he finds changes in the blood and in the sperm and in the brain. Right in that first generation, their brains, the mice that are shocked, had enlarged. There's enlarged areas in the brain where there's now a greater amount of smell receptors that can detect this scent at lesser concentrations. So the brains already have epigenetically adapted in the first generation to protect them. If they can smell, if I'm a mouse and I can smell the scent earlier at lesser concentrations, I'm safer. So that's so cool. It's how we work, right? We develop these epigenetic adaptations. Well, the researchers had this idea. What if I take some of the sperm where there's these epigenetic adaptations, these changes, and impregnate females that are not shocked, and then separate out the mice that were shocked so there's no learning into the, we're not learning it from our parents, into the next generation. Then the amazing thing is what happens in the second and third generations. The pups and the grandpups become jumpy and jittery just by smelling the smell. They've inherited the stress response without directly experiencing the trauma. Wow. And, I said earlier, one of the most replicated studies in all of epigenetics is that baby mice are separated from their moms, like my grandparents were. And you can see the effects for 3 generations. There's this passage in my book. It's 4 lines. I'm going to read it to you.
Please.
Four potent lines. So here, in one such study, researchers prevented females from nurturing their pups for up to 3 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of life. That's it, Palmer.
Just 2 weeks.
That's it. For only 3 hours a day, they keep the moms from nurturing the pups. Let me keep reading. Later in life, their offspring exhibited behaviors similar to what we call depression in humans. The symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice aged. And surprisingly, some of the male mice did not express the behaviors themselves, but appeared to epigenetically transmit the behavioral changes to their female offspring. That's like fathers going off to war and coming back numb from the trauma, and daughters carrying their father's fight, flight, or freeze response, his shaking, his terror, his shutdown. And it's not just fathers and daughters, because, as we know, inherited family trauma is equal opportunity employer, unfortunately. So male children and female children are equally impacted by a mother or a father's trauma. In fact, just recently in Journal of American Medicine, JAMA Psychiatry, they followed mothers who suffered trauma as children and found that their daughters were more likely to struggle with depression and bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. And then in a recent Tufts University study, they looked at men, and they found out that men who suffered trauma as children, who had high ACE scores, adverse childhood experience scores, they're able to pass their anxiety on to their children through their sperm. Now, what's interesting, this is the first study to show that the human sperm mirrored the same changes, the same non-coding RNA. That's one of the mechanisms of epigenetic transfer that were found in the mice that were traumatized in labs. So I don't know how far into the science you need me to go. We can cut this part if you don't need it.
No, I love it. I love it. I'm actually going to ask you to go deeper, but I think this is fantastic.
Great. Let me do just a little bit more.
Yeah,
because
please.
RNA we know is copied from, or we don't know, but it's copied from DNA, and it acts as a messenger to instruct the cell's ribosomes to produce specific proteins. Now, cells also contain small non-coding RNA that don't produce proteins. But what they do is they piggyback on the messenger RNAs, and they interfere with or amplify their function, causing more or less of certain proteins to be produced, affecting more or less which genes get activated or genes get actively expressed. One of the researchers I like a whole lot, she's doing some fascinating work in the field with both mice and humans, is a woman named Isabelle Monsuy at the Brain Research Institute at the University of Zurich. And, I could just go, you cut anything you want, but I love to talk about the science.
So I love it.
She separates baby mice from their mothers, or she takes the mothers and stresses them out by putting them in a glass jar or something like this. And then she brings them back. And these mice begin to show symptoms of depression and despair. Now she has this idea: what happens when I drop these mice that are depressed in a bowl of water? Well, the mice that weren't separated from the mothers are swimming around the edge of the bowl trying to get out. But the mice that were depressed, they don't even swim at all. They hardly swim. They float and eventually drown. Their brain cells and sperm cells show this excessive number of small non-coding RNA molecules, and they've inherited this learned helplessness or this depression. And 3 generations later, the mice that inherited these RNA molecules float without experiencing the original trauma. Once again, they're expressing the stress response, the gene expression, but they didn't experience the trauma.
Wow. This is so fascinating, and I am so excited that the science has caught up with what you figured out in your own journey, right? I mean, it's remarkable. We're getting more and more research on this topic. And I'd like to go back to your first case where you actually were working with a patient, where you kind of figured this out just by looking at her breadcrumbs. So talk with us about that one.
Yeah. It's a pretty heavy case, but I'd like to tell it because, it was the case that shifted my whole perspective. So here I am. I don't know a darn thing about inherited family trauma, but I'm working with a lot of self-injurers, a lot of cutters, burners, bangers, people who bang themselves head first into walls, people who take cigarettes, burn themselves, people who cut. This one woman, she's 24 years old, and she cuts in a pattern that's different than the other cutters I'm working with. When she cuts into her arm or her leg or her abdomen, she cuts so deeply that she hits a vessel, and she nearly bleeds to death. And her parents rush her to the hospital because she's going to die if they don't to stop the bleeding. Now, when they get her in the hospital, of course, they put her in a psych ward because they think she's trying to kill herself. And they put her in a psych ward for 3-4 weeks at a time. And then when she gets out, one of those times, she came to my office and looking for a pen. And I don't have a pen, but I'm going to use this bottle. And I said, I'm going to call her Sarah for the sake of the interview, not her real name. I said, Sarah, take this pen and show me how you cut. Pretend it's your knife. So she takes the pen and she puts it to her arm. And I say, Sarah, just show me exactly what you do. And in that moment, she begins to glaze over. She begins to dissociate. I could see she's frozen. And I go, stop, right there. What's that feeling? What's that impulse? What's that sensation? And she looks at me and says, I deserve to die. I don't deserve to live. Here I am looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life has just begun. And I say the obvious, what did you do? What have you done, Sarah? Did you cause an accident? Did you take somebody's life? Did you break up with somebody who killed themselves? And she said, no, nothing like that. So I did the usual things I knew how to do. I asked about her mom. I asked about her dad. I asked about her attachment. Well, has a great relationship with her mom. She's able to receive her mom's love and care and nurturance. She's able to, loves her dad. She's able to take in his warmth, his love, his care. So I think it has to be attachment. Everything's attachment, right? So I start to look at that. No, she's got a strong, secure, potent, safe attachment with her mom. I'm flummoxed. I don't know what to do. So luckily, the wisdom asks this question. And I said, okay, Sarah, tell me about your grandparents. Well, it was the right question. And boom, she drops the bomb. Her dad's mother was an alcoholic, and she was driving the car drunk, and she crashed into a telephone pole. And she lived, but Grandpa, who was in the passenger seat, went through the windshield and got cut, lacerated on the glass, and bled to death before the ambulance arrived. And in that minute, the whole story's told, because he's the one who bleeds to death, and Grandma's the one who feels, for taking the life of her beloved, that she doesn't deserve to live. She deserves to die for killing another person, her beloved. So in that moment, I go, oh. And I was a student of psychodrama at this time, student of John Nolte's in psychodrama. So I knew exactly what to do. I put 2 chairs out in the office, and I had Sarah look at the chairs and see her grandparents, who she never met, because this happened when Dad was 12. So she looks at her grandfather, closes. I said, look at him in the chair and close your eyes and tell him what you do. And she said, Grandpa, I cut myself. Go tell him how deeply you cut. Grandpa, I cut myself so deeply. Add these words. Tell him that you cut yourself so deeply that you nearly bleed to death. And she goes, Grandpa, I cut myself so deeply I nearly bleed to death. And I say, add the words like you did. And she goes, like you did. Now she's crying. And it's very moving and touching. And I said, so what's he showing you? What's he saying to you or showing you in the chair? She goes, he's showing me that he doesn't want me to do this anymore, and that he'll be with me as a resource, as a support. And whenever I have the feeling to cut, just feel him there holding me and with me. And I go, okay, let's turn to your grandmother in the chair. Tell her, Grandma, all my life I've been feeling I don't deserve to live. I deserve to die. And I've just figured out, Grandma, these aren't my words. These would be your feelings. That this is what you would feel after the accident. And she's never met her grandparents, because the grandma's been long dead before she was born. The grandmother, I think, died when the father was 20, and he didn't get married till his late 20s. So I said, what's she saying to you or showing to you? And she's saying, she too doesn't want me to feel this way. And she says, when I feel this way, to think of her and breathe back these feelings that were never hers in the first place. So I do that with her there. I go, well, let's find that feeling in your body of I deserve to die. And she locates it in her solar plexus, and she puts her hand there, and I say, Grandma, this isn't mine. I'm going to breathe this feeling out of my body to where it originates. And in that beginning, I discovered how to work with inherited family trauma. It doesn't end there. I actually had her bring her dad in. And Sarah sat over there on the couch while I work with her dad. Now, the dad, he couldn't heal because he's angry at his mom for taking his dad's life. So the dad, which was interesting, I have the dad sitting in the chair, and he can't even grieve his father, because every time he gets into the grief, he's rageful, which is a secondary emotion, blocking the primary emotion, which is sadness and grief. So whenever he goes to grieve his dad, he gets rageful toward his mother. So we go back to work with the mother at this point, and I go, look behind her. What happened to her that made her an alcoholic? And he says, oh, I know this. She was given away to foster care when she was 3. And I turn to him and I go, well, of course she drank. She was looking for the security, the safety, the dopamine that was gone. And he goes, ah. And in that moment, he's able to have compassion for his mother. And in that moment, he's able to grieve his father. His beautiful session. And Sarah's watching it. But the most potent thing, this is the most potent thing that happened in the session, Palmer. He stands up. He turns to Sarah, not her real name. And he said, Sarah, I've got this. You leave this with me. And she never cut again. So, it's so interesting. And also in that moment, I learned everything about my next direction. And then, of course, I meet one of my greatest teachers, Bert Hellinger, the father of Family Constellations, and begin a new journey.
That is so beautiful and so instructive. And our patients, our clients can often be our best teachers. And it sounds like this was just such an incredibly healing journey for your client, her family, her entire family, not just her, but you too. And then the patients that you've gone on to help, which is amazing. And I mean, there's so much that we can talk about, and I want to go in any direction you want to go in because I want you to feel complete about this. But I do want to get into breaking the cycle of pain, and I want you to help us with clues that people can look for. What signs are there? How can somebody tell that they may be dealing with somebody else's trauma? So let me just tell you from my perspective, I help people recover from autoimmune conditions. And we typically start with mindset, and then we get into food and gut healing. And if they don't heal from there, we start getting to other layers like possible infections and toxins. And certainly emotional trauma is part of it. But what are the clues that people can look for that they might decide, you know what, this is something that I need to explore?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking it. So we can be born with a depression or an anxiety and never separated from what happened in the generation before us. It's true. But we can also suddenly experience a fear or a symptom that strikes unexpectedly or suddenly when we reach a certain age, or hit a certain milestone or a certain event in our lives. For example, as soon as we get married, in the book, I talk about this woman who she loved this guy and wanted to marry him, and she knew it was the right guy. But as soon as she marries him, which is one of the triggers, as soon as she gets married, she doesn't understand, but she feels incredibly trapped. And she comes and we work together. And when we looked in her family history, we found out that in her family history, both of her grandmothers were given away as child brides, one at 9 and one at 12 in Iraq, both given away to these men 30 years older. And they lived these trapped, loveless lives. And, it was so interesting. She made the connection that the reason she felt as soon as she got married, she felt trapped is she was reliving the traumas of her grandmothers. And then when you looked at this, I worked with both of her sisters. It was so funny. The one sister marries a much older man, 30 years older, like the grandmothers. And the other sister refused to ever get married at all. So getting married, that can be a trigger. Another trigger could be getting rejected by a partner. And even though we've only dated this partner for 2 or 3 months, our life's over, we're never going to recover, because it takes us to a much deeper grief, a grief that's insurmountable. Maybe it takes us back to a break in the attachment with our mom that we haven't healed. Or we move to a new place. That's another trigger. And suddenly we get depressed like the ancestors that were persecuted and forced to move out of their homeland. And all we did was move across the block, move 2 blocks away. Or we go to have a child, and suddenly this ancestral alarm clock, as I like to call it, starts ringing inside us. I once worked with this woman. She was consumed with anxiety as soon as she became pregnant. And we discovered that she had a terrible fear of harming her baby. And so I asked her if she'd ever harmed a baby. She said, of course not. And I said, did anyone in the family ever harm a baby? And she's about to say no. She said, no. And all of a sudden she said, oh, wait a minute. My mother's mother, my grandmother, when she was a young bride or a young newlywed, she was pregnant or not pregnant. She had a baby. the baby was upstairs sleeping, and she lit a candle downstairs, caught the curtains on fire, caught the house on fire, and she couldn't get the baby out, and the baby died. And she said, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And in that moment, she'd made the link that she was carrying the terror of her grandmother. And also that idea of never being allowed to talk about it.
Yes.
What I've learned is one of the things that makes traumas repeat. What I've seen is that, most of us have inherited family trauma, but not everybody manifests it. So what is it? What is it that makes some people seem to relive and others not? Epigenetics is just one piece of the puzzle, because we know that when our grandmom is 5 months pregnant with our mother at 5 months of fetus will have all the eggs she's ever going to have, because the female cell line stops dividing. But one of those eggs is us, embedded in our mother's womb when she's embedded in grandmother's womb. And then we know from the work of Bruce Lipton that a mother's emotions are chemically communicated to the fetus through the placenta, biochemically altering the genetic expression. So, there's all these factors, but what anchors these traumas, what I found, what creates these repetitions, is when traumas aren't talked about. Mm. When the healing is incomplete, when the pain or the grief or the embarrassment or the shame is too great, we can't contact the trauma, or the people in our family system are excluded or rejected, or basically there's not been any resolution. Then what we find is these traumas show up in later generations, and unconsciously we'll repeat the patterns. We'll share a similar unhappiness as our parents and our grandparents until these traumas finally have a chance to heal.
They're resolved. They're brought to light.
Freud observed this 100 years ago when he talked about repetition compulsion. The contraction of the trauma is seeking its expansion. Those are my words. Those aren't Freud's. Freud would say that the trauma keeps repeating, looking for a better outcome. Mm. And what I say is, this, in the wisdom of the trauma, in the contraction that keeps repeating, it's seeking its expansion. So there's a genius, a wisdom in these repetitions, because it wants to heal.
It wants to be brought to light.
Right.
I kind of want to pause for a moment, because this is so profound. And what I'm hearing you say on so many levels is, maybe it starts with an awareness that maybe the break in an attachment that we had. So let me ask you this. Our relationship, if there is some break that we have, or if we've rejected a parent, or if there's somehow something where we're cut off, is that a path back in? Are you suggesting that
totally? Oh my God.
Okay,
totally.
Let's talk about that.
Okay, look, a lot of us have had some really difficult parenting.
Yes.
And a lot of us can't heal these relationships in real time with our parents. So we have to heal through visualization. But the bottom line is, we have to heal these relationships at some level, even if we can't do it in real time. Look, when we reject a parent, we actually reject aspects of ourselves that we can't even see, because we've disowned the behavior in that parent we don't like. She's cold. She's critical. We can't see when we're the same, because we've disowned that behavior in ourselves. And so it can express in us unconsciously. It does express in us unconsciously. And even in illness, our bodies mirror that rejection. For example, if we didn't feel supported by our parents, we often don't feel supported by our bodies. And we can struggle with chronic, but the body becomes the enemy. It's like, look what it's doing to me, because we feel, it's often part of that disconnect. We can struggle with chronic pain and chronic fatigue, autoimmune symptoms, chronic tightness, migraines, Lyme, numbness. Also, when our inner image of our parents is that they couldn't be gentle with us, we have difficulty being gentle with us, being gentle with the child inside of us, the child parts of us. And we often do to ourselves what we perceive was done to us. So if our parents were critical or aggressive, we become self-critical or inwardly aggressive. Or if our parents ignored us or were distant, we become distant or ignore that inner child, that part of us that's so small and tender. I'm not making this up. There's this brilliant study that comes from Harvard in the 1950s called, and I've mentioned this, of course, in my book, the Harvard Mastery of Stress Study. Say that 3 times, Harvard Mastery of Stress Study. What they did is they asked one question to 21-year-olds that were just beginning Harvard, I think, medical school. They said to the students, okay, we're going to ask you one question. And it was a longitudinal study that followed them for 35 years. Check a box. Your relationship with your mother and your father. Was it warm and close? That was box 1. Was it friendly? Box 2. Was it tolerant? Box 3. Or was it strained and cold? Box 4. Do you know that if you checked tolerant or strained and cold with your mother, 35 years later, 91% of the recipients or the participants, 91% had a significant health condition like coronary artery disease, diabetes, alcoholism, cancer, compared with only 45%, less than half, that checked warm, close, or friendly. So the same numbers with the father, 82 to 50%. So it's, healing these relationships with our parents, it's not just a good idea. It can cost us our lives. In a sense. The question, can we take in their love and care not as we expected, but just as they gave it? At the very least, can we hold them differently inside us? Can we drop the story that we have about them? I found that the more we reject our parents, the more we suffer. Straight out. And what's unhealed in us continues to live on as those rejections get magnified. Now, healing with them means that we're in tune with what they could give us as well as what they could not give us. That's healing. Healing means, they could do this, but they certainly couldn't do this. But I no longer carry the emotional charge around it. And that's the big thing, because a lot of us have this emotional charge about what our parents did to us. And then we turn to a partner and we're rageful or expecting that partner to treat us the same way. And in fact, we pull in partners that do treat us that same way, or we pull in a partner who's really nice, but because we're hyper vigilant and untrusting, that partner in very short time ends up acting the way we are afraid they'll act, because our hypervigilance and lack of trust lives in our eyes. So when we carry painful images of what our parents did to us, this is a template, a blueprint that lives inside us, that forges our later relationships and drives these early traumas to continue repeating.
And it wants to continue expanding, as you so eloquently said, until we take responsibility and stop that cycle and decide.
That's a lot of suffering,
that it ends right here. However long it's been passed down, the buck stops here. It sounds like that's what you're saying. So
I am. And some of us have to go and repeat these traumas a gazillion times. And the suffering is so great.
Yeah.
Until we can find something inside ourselves that can let go. And when I say let go, I'm talking about the emotional charge.
Yes.
At the very least, can we drop the emotional charge. Many of my clients, they can't heal with the mother they're angry at. So what I'll do is I'll suggest a practice that they can do at night before they go to sleep. For example, I'll say, here, get a photo of your mom. Try to find a friendly photo of your mom when she is, 18, 19, 20, 25, 30, when she's young. Photo that you like. Tape it above your left shoulder, above your pillow, or on your bed frame, or put it on your nightstand. And at night, say to the photo, hey, Mom, I can't do this in real life, right? Say to the photo, Mom, please hold me when I'm sleeping so I can feel safe in my body. And then I add these words: teach me how to trust your love, how to receive it, and how to let it in. And if you were a giver to your mother, add these words: without taking care of you, just receiving. And then visualize that this is being guided by some higher force, or you're talking to your mom's higher self, or that this has a spiritual practice, and visualize that you're being held and reattaching, because we're healing this broken attachment, in some way where you're receiving something good from what she gave. Because in many ways, Mom is a metaphor for life. And what she didn't provide for us, we don't trust a partner to provide. If we didn't feel nurtured by her, we don't let ourselves be nurtured by food, as we know. The very thing that sustains us, and if, we can often struggle with food sensitivities or food allergies, because mother's the metaphor for what we take in. And if she didn't make us feel secure, we don't feel secure in life. And if there were events in utero, for example, Palmer, we can have, in that early environment, we can have sensitivities to the outer environment, sensitivities to food and sounds and mold and noise and light and smells. You get it? Of course you get it.
I get this.
This is what you teach.
Well, I want to share that I not only get this profoundly because I've studied it, but I get it profoundly because I'm adopted. And my birth mother was 14 years old.
Oh, right.
And I'm just thankful that I'm here.
So, you know what? Forgive or permit me to say, with that inner environment of, I can't keep you, I have to give you away, I can't keep you. The lack of safety of the environment you would know intimately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right. And it explains a lot about my own hypervigilance as a child, always scanning the environment for safety, the conflict that I had with my dad that was profound. Who are these people? And then ultimately the development of MS at 19. So not surprising. And part of that healing is repairing that bond, that loss, that deep grief. And that's the opportunity, right? I mean, I don't even have a photograph of her. I know she's passed away. So my opportunity is on the spiritual level that you're talking about, to really receive that love. And I know that it was such a gift and she did the best she could. So I don't pass blame. And that's how I am with this.
Oh, she was 14.
14
what else
years
could
old.
she do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So lucky.
Yeah.
So you talk about some other things that we can do to heal. And it sounds like that visualization. I mean, you're not even talking about having to necessarily re-engage with a parent. They might be dead, long gone. So there is that visualization process, that imagining process. What else can we do? You have some techniques that you describe in the book that involve pausing during the day. Can you talk to us about those things?
Yeah. Well, let me first wind it back to mice, because I think it's important. So the very mice that they traumatize in labs, they're finding that they can untraumatize. They can reverse the trauma symptoms. So when they find out when these mice that had been traumatized are exposed to positive experiences, it changes the way the DNA expresses. Technically, it inhibits the enzymes that cause DNA methylation, histone modifications, Remember, I talked about Isabelle Monsuy. She was traumatizing these mouse, dropping them in the water and watching them drown. Well, she takes the same mice as adults and puts them in positive, low stress environments, and the trauma symptoms reverse. Their behaviors improve. There's changes that gene changes that prevent the symptoms from being transmitted to the next generation. And remember the mice I talked about that were fearing the cherry blossom scent?
Yes.
Well, Brian Diaz, the researcher, does the same thing. He teaches them not to fear it by repeatedly exposing them to it, but not shocking them. And so they no longer had that fearful epigenetic signature that could live in their sperm and pass to future generations. So mice aren't the only ones who benefit, of course, from positive experiences. It's how we heal from inherited trauma. We have got to calm that stress response. We've got to calm the brain's stress response, and whether that stress response is inherited from our parents or grandparents, or whether it happened to us from an early trauma. So basically, to heal, we've got to have positive experiences, and then strong enough to change our brain. And then we need to practice the new feelings and the new sensations associated with these new positive experiences. And when we do this, we not only create new neural pathways, but we also stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters in our brain, like serotonin and dopamine and GABA. And we also can stimulate the release of feel-good hormones that we need for healing, like oxytocin and estrogen. And then even the very genes involved in the body's stress response can begin to function in an improved way. Now, these positive experiences that I'm talking about can be practices of receiving comfort or support, or like Sarah. Remember Sarah, whose grandparents are going to comfort and support her every time she's in a stress response? So I teach that in the book, how to receive comfort and support when we didn't have any. Or feelings, they can also be practices of compassion or practices of gratitude, like Oprah taught us, or practices of, having a generosity practice, or practices of loving kindness, or practicing mindfulness. Ultimately, anything that allows us to feel strength or peace or joy inside, because these types of experience, strength, peace, joy, wonder, curiosity, awe, compassion, comfort, support, gratitude, loving kindness, I can name generosity. These types of experiences feed the prefrontal cortex and help us to reframe that stress response so it has a chance to downregulate. And, basically, to put it in a nutshell, we need to practice being with, first, what's uncomfortable in our body, because that's what first, as soon as people confront the body and go, oh, great, I'll have a mindfulness practice. Because I read so much of mindfulness, they then find what's uncomfortable in the body. So we need to practice being with what's uncomfortable, the uncomfortable sensations in our body, until we can reach what's beneath them, the sensations we experience as life-giving, sensations like pulsing, tingling, softening, expanding, blood flowing, waves, currents, waves of energy, warmth. And then we need to be able to hold these positive sensations for at least a minute, 6 times, and do this 6 times a day. And that can be enough to change the brain and calm our stress response.
That is so hopeful. And it's such a clear path. I mean, it sounds like it starts with a level of awareness. Like you might have some mysterious symptoms or experience some pain in your body. And what you're inviting us to do is to sit with it and to not push it away, but just to be with it and then go underneath it if you can, to the foundation of the chi that's flowing in our bodies, the energy, the pulsing, those sensations, and then maybe
Totally.
soften a little bit. And as we soften into that, we can, I just feel myself, my shoulders are going down thinking about, softening,
Totally.
right? We soften
Totally.
into it and just allow our bodies that want to be whole and healed to come back into balance.
Exactly, Paul.
But it sounds like, and this is the rub, and I talk often about doing the soft belly breathing, remembering to do it can actually be the trickiest part with establishing any kind of practice. So do you recommend with your clients that they set a gentle chime or have specific times during the day just to get started on this 6 times a day for at least 1 minute? What do you advise?
I do, because we know from the neuroscience, we know that focus and repetition is the key. And it's not like putting that 6 minutes all into 1 minute. It's repeatedly throughout the day, setting a chime or doing it before we eat or before we go to bed, which is a very potent time for neuroplastic change, or when we first wake up, or, and I want to add to it. And those of us with symptoms that you were speaking about when you had MS, and me with the retinopathy, also not attaching to an outcome. Don't get attached to this idea that if I do this practice, my eye will get better, my MS will get better. We do the practice because it feels right inside. That's why we do the practice.
That's right.
Healing from an illness is never something we can control. And I find just by committing to the inner practice, whatever that practice is, letting that inner practice, allowing it to touch us deeply, Palmer, this practice. I do it because it touches me. I do it because it's meaningful. I do it because it's relevant, it's potent. And that allows us to become more expanded inside. And then when we're more expanded inside, guess what? Our symptoms aren't that important anymore. Our symptoms become less important. They might even go away. Which is that thing that I experienced, taking it back to my own experience years ago. I was doing so much meditation at that point that in the beginning, people would say, "So you're doing all this meditation. Is your eye better?" And I go, "Oh, my eye. No, my eye's still doing what it's doing in the beginning. But there was a different eye, the eye inside." And I would say, "But I'm doing really well." It's the eye inside was doing quite well, and the eye on the outside wasn't. And then one day, the eye on the outside cleared, and I didn't even. It was the strangest thing. I didn't even need it to at that point. I wasn't connected to the outcome. I was digging the eye inside, the experience with the eye inside. And that's when things shifted. It was not me connected to the outcome. It was me living inside the process.
That's right. That's right. It's not being so focused on external things to make us heal and whole. But when we can go deeply and just be and practice these feelings and these sensations, that this positive upward spiral that we're creating with gratitude and generosity and self-compassion, all of a sudden, what symptoms, right? They lessen. I find oftentimes that there's a softening. There's maybe a motivation to go even deeper when we stop seeking so much from the outside to fix us or to heal us. And just being comfortable with sitting, which can often be very difficult for people, but to just stay there. I love that you talk about going underneath the surface symptoms. It's an invitation to dig deeper, which is profound.
Right, where most of us get stuck. They go, "Oh no, I can't do meditation.
Can't do it.
I tried it, and my body got anxiety. My body got anxious." Yes, that was the perfect doorway. Your anxiety was the perfect doorway, because if we open the door to this anxiety and travel inside it, ultimately we're going to find other sensations and ultimately our own presence. And not to push the doors away, but to keep opening them. Yeah.
I'm so excited about this conversation with you, and I'm really excited for people to read your book. I mean, it's just a profoundly important work, and I want to read the title again so that people know what they should look for. It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. Mark, this has been fantastic. If people want to get in touch with you, learn more about your work, where can they find you?
They can find me at markwolynn.com, markwolynn.com. I'm, of course, on all the social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I do want to just say, if we have a moment, what I do in the book is interesting. I teach the reader in the first third of the book to become a detective of his or her trauma language. And that's verbal and nonverbal trauma language. Remember, Sarah, her verbal trauma language was this idea, I don't deserve to live, which wasn't hers. And her nonverbal trauma language, which was cutting so deeply she would nearly die, is what happened to her grandfather. And then in the second part of the book, I teach people how to link this verbal and nonverbal trauma language to the events in your own family history. And then, as you talked about, in the third part of the book, I give practices, visualizations, and healing sentences and healing experiences that help us change the brain.
That's beautiful. And I want to just offer to you, if you have any final thoughts that you didn't get a chance to share, I'd love to know what they are.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to this idea of healing our relationship with our parents. I just think that no matter, so many of us, I find most of us are struggling with unexplained symptoms, or our children are struggling with symptoms. And I also find many of us are struggling with aspects of a break in the attachment with our mom, even though we can have a great attachment, a great relationship with our mom. But that relationship can be us giving to her, us providing comfort for her, rather than receiving. Many of us don't receive. And it's important to examine these relationships to make sure we're able to receive our parents' love and nurturance and care, even if we can't do it in real life. Even if those relationships are broken or our parents have passed away, that we can visualize in some way to receive something.
This was really profound, Mark. I am so grateful that you joined me today. This will serve so many people and give them these golden breadcrumbs to help people recover from physical, emotional, spiritual illnesses, separation. I'm really grateful for you. Thank you so much.
Palmer, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed being with you in the show here and talking with you and connecting with you. We have like minds.
We do. And I hope we have many more conversations. I wish you well, and I look forward to the next time soon.
Wonderful. Me too.
And that's a wrap. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with your friends and family, and if you feel inspired, please leave a quick review so other people can find it too. Now, if you want to beat autoimmune and thrive, make sure you sign up for my free video training at freeautoimmunetraining.com. That's freeautoimmunetraining.com, and watch the first video right away. Take good care. Bye for now.